Hi, this is Congressman Tom Cole. This is another one of our weekly chats, and as you can see, I'm actually back in my official office in Washington, D.C. Been a pretty heavy week in Congress this week. On the Rules Committee, the Democrats brought 5 different bills to the Rules Committee to later go on the floor. We've dealt with a couple of them this week. We'll deal with the remainder of them next week. Unfortunately, each one of those bills was extremely partisan, and in each case, they came to the floor under what's called a closed rule. That is, no amendments were allowed by the minority. The most important bill that you've undoubtedly heard the most about is the police reform bill. And I regard this as a great missed opportunity. There's actually a Republican version of this bill that has considerable overlap with the Democratic version. That is, both make lynching a federal crime, both get rid of chokeholds except in deadly situation. Both have a national registry for police officers that have committed abuses, so they're not inadvertently hired by another police officer. In other words, there were a lot of things in common between the two bills, and there was a signal from the Republican side in the Senate that they were willing to negotiate. Unfortunately, the Democrats again put together their own bill with absolutely no Republican input and absolutely no Republican amendments in the House. In the Senate, where it takes 60 votes to proceed, Senator Tim Scott had the Republican bill. He's an African-American from South Carolina. Again, essentially the identical bill that we have in the House, really based on his work and on the work of some police officers in the House. Senator Scott said, I'm willing to work with anybody, offered the Democrats amendments, but it takes 60 votes to bring up a matter on the Senate floor. Every Republican, that's 53 Republicans, voted to do that. By the way, so did 2 Democrats and an independent from Maine. But the decision was made by the Democratic leadership, rather than actually negotiate in good faith and have a bill that we could go to conference with, each side, a Republican Senate having produced a bill, a Democratic House, they decided they would just shut down the process, essentially, and try to jam the Republicans. That's not going to work. Quite frankly, I talked to many police chiefs in my district, and they were willing to embrace many of these reforms. As a matter of fact, quite frankly, many of them already had done so in previous years in their individual department policies. But they were all united on the need for what's called qualified immunity for police officers. That is, if they do something wrong, they can be sued. But if they pursue the normal operations, normal scope of duty, do not use excessive force, they can't be. And the reality is most lawsuits against most police officers are frivolous. They're meant to harass. And what my police chiefs that I represent were worried about was that if you got rid of that immunity, they wouldn't be able to recruit or retain police officers. That's going to make every single American less safe, whether you're in a minority community or you're in an affluent suburb or you're in a small rural town. We need police officers. This idea of defunding police departments, I think, is a ridiculous idea and a dangerous idea. So it's a missed opportunity in my view. Now, maybe something can still be worked out. I would hope so. But the president's made apparent that he's not going to sign the Democratic bill. The Republican Senate has made it apparent they're not going to pass the Democratic bill. So if you want to have a real bill and do some important reforms, you need to sit down and bargain in good faith. Sadly, this week on that issue, my Democratic friends have decided not to do it. Another issue that I disagreed very much with my Democratic colleagues on is their desire to make the District of Columbia a state. That's a ridiculous idea. Constitution sets it aside as a federal city, not as a state. I think it would require a constitutional amendment. In my view, this is all about getting 2 more United States senators that are almost certainly going to be Democratic. The Republicans actually did offer another way out. If you know our history, part of the original District of Columbia was in Virginia. And that land was actually ceded back to Virginia when it was apparent it wasn't necessary. We could do exactly the same thing with the remainder of the District of Columbia. That is, cut out a federal campus that would include the monuments, the Capitol, the White House, most of the main federal buildings, perhaps the foreign embassies, but turn the rest of the area back to the state of Maryland. It has sufficient population that would get a full congressional seat, and those voters would also be represented by the 2 senators from Maryland. That, to me, is a realistic compromise. But under no circumstances should the District of Columbia, which is not a state, was never designed to be a state, gets all sorts of assistance that no other state receives, be allowed to become a state simply so the Democrats can pick up 2 more senators. I think it's an outrageous idea. Regardless, of course, it moved through pretty much on a party line vote. It'll be dead on arrival in the Senate. The president would never sign it. So unfortunately, we're now into political messaging bills and into simply trying to jam the other side. That's not going to work. I still think there's time to get things done this session. We should get a police reform bill done. We should get normal appropriations passed. But until and unless Democrats decide they want to legislate as opposed to simply make political points, that's not going to happen. In the balance of this year, the only way to get anything done is to compromise. A Republican Senate and a Republican president will have to compromise with a Democratic House and vice versa. Democrats simply can't dictate what's going to happen. Sooner people learn that or try to legislate in good faith, the better off the country will be. But if the decision is we're simply going to pass bills we know can't pass the other chamber or be signed by the president, then we're already into the midst of the 2020 political campaign. And what we're doing here has more to do with politics than it does to do with sound policy. We're going to keep working hard on behalf of the people of the 4th District of Oklahoma, represent their views, their values, and their interests. I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will do the same.